Can I follow up one question, though, Tom?
Yes.
So when it comes to self-inquiry, is the definition for self-inquiry the act of saying, who am I, and looking? Or is the definition of self-inquiry turning within to the self? And my experience of asking, who am I, and looking is that over time, I've sensed a better ability to do it without actually being liberating. But in the beginning, I would think I was doing it, and then later I would feel like, oh God, I was in concepts, and this feels a little more truer. But I see it referred to as the actual turning within of the mind into the self is self-inquiry. So when we're saying do self-inquiry, or saying you can do self-inquiry, are we saying you can do the motions and see where you are? Or are we saying you are turning within in a liberating moment?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, actually. So there's, I guess you could, is what you're asking, let me just clarify, is what you're asking, there are two things really. There's one, the attempt to do self-inquiry, which may or may not be successful. And then there's the successful act of successfully, there's the act of successfully performing self-inquiry such that it leads to liberation.
Right. There's an interim where you're able to turn within and have some time of no thought.
Okay, so you're saying there are three things. One, there's the attempt. Two, there's an interim where you're actually being relatively successful. And then there's maybe three, success, which is liberation. Right. So you've got like three stages of self-inquiry we could posit. There's the beginners where you're just attempting and maybe not doing that great. There's the intermediate where you're actually making, you're actually becoming proficient in self-inquiry. And then there's the advanced or the liberated, where you graduated, Yes, I mean, we could use self-inquiry. And this is perhaps where the term isn't so well defined, Actually, all of those three would be self-inquiry. And the reality is that for most people, you can go straight to advanced or graduation, but most people are going to go through the beginner and intermediate phase first. So only the advanced will lead to liberation, but the attempts are required to get there for most people. Do you see? So that entire thing is self-inquiry. The attempts, the failed attempts, the repeatedly failed attempts, this is self-inquiry. Well, this is attempt to do self-inquiry. And then you start to achieve success. You start to abide as the self. And then you go deeper and realize the self.
So even here, what I've heard is there are attempts to do self-inquiry, and then there's self-inquiry.
Yes.
And it's only the final that is actually self-inquiry. But prior to that, it's attempts to do self-inquiry.
Yes. Yes, you could say that. But the attempts to do self-inquiry are a part of the process. Again, let's take a tennis analogy. Yeah, you go to a tennis lesson. You've never played tennis before, right? So when you go to your first tennis lesson, what are you doing? Are you playing tennis? or you're attempting to play tennis. You could say, I'm attempting to play tennis. Yeah. And then I could say to you, well, you're not going to a tennis lesson, then are you? You're going to an attempting to play tennis. You're going to an attempting to play tennis lesson because you're not playing tennis, are you? You're just attempting to play. You can't play yet. Look at you. You see, you could say that. Does the analogy make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think the way the analogy would
But in a more general term, we would say, look, you're learning to play tennis. You're playing tennis. I just played some tennis, but maybe you haven't actually played yet. Maybe you're still figuring it out. But that's where you start.
I know. I think the analogy would be the person who, at what point of their playing tennis do they actually get the designation of tennis player? You know what I mean? So
yeah,
that's
why does that matter then?
Because you only get that designation when you get the attempt right.
Yeah, but why does that matter?
Because until then, you keep trying and you are still suffering through trying to learn to play tennis until you get the designation.
Okay. So to answer that query, I would say that the trying and the suffering will continue right until liberation. Right up until liberation, for most people, they'll feel like they can't do self-inquiry that well. They'll be struggling with it. They'll have good days or have bad days. This is what it will probably be like for most people until liberation happens. So even when you're highly proficient at self-inquiry, because of the nature of Maya can multiply from like 1% to 1,000,000%, just like that. So you might be very proficient at self-inquiry. You might be thinking, oh, I've got this. I know what to do now. You know, and then the next day you're fully entrenched in Maya. This is the way Maya works. So even the highly proficient person who's able to do self-inquiry very well, they're still actually seeking and suffering and they can't figure it out. You could say, and this is just going to ruin everything else I've just said, you could say, really, you only do self-inquiry properly once. And the rest of the time, you're just trying to figure out how to do self-inquiry. Once you figure out how to do self-inquiry properly, you do self-inquiry properly once, that's it. That's liberation. Everything else is practice or attempting to do self-inquiry. Because even when we talk about abiding as the self, they're not really abiding as the self. If you're really abiding as the self, that's liberation straight away. So when we say abiding as a self, we're actually just saying it's a very subtle layer of ignorance is still there. So you're not actually abiding as a self. If you can abide as the self for 1 second, for 1 millisecond, then you will, then that is real. Then you'll realize the self, and that's it. It's a bit more like playing golf and trying to hit a hole in one, you know, well, something like that. You get some people when they start, they're nowhere near hitting a hole in one, right? And then you get the proficient ones who are almost hitting a hole in one, right? And they'll be like the people abiding as the self. Every time they strike the ball, the golf ball with the golf club, it goes very near the hole. And you look at them, you think, wow, look at that, they're amazing. Yeah, they still haven't got the hole in one though. And then one day, one of them gets a hole in one. That's it. Until then, though, you're still confused, alternating confused and not confused, alternating happy, suffering. Do you see what I mean? But you have to go through that process to get the hole in one. So self-inquiry is in some ways, it's very unfulfilling because once you feel fulfilled with it, truly fulfilled, that's it. You only get to do that once. You see, just as you're getting really proficient, you do it and that's it, it's over.